Welcome. I'm becoming, it's becoming harder and harder for me to read. So the last time I tried to print something, I couldn't read it. So this time I'm coming with my iPad because otherwise I can't read anything I write at this point. But my name is Emanuel Rota, I know that much. And on behalf of the European Union Center, which I had the pleasure to direct, welcome to this fantastic event. Since February 2022, we have lived the horror of a nuclear power invading a European country for territorial gain. Friends, even close friends, were uncertain about what to say. Peace is certainly an important value, but so is the principle of self-determination that is a crucial value of any democracy. Other friends complain about the amount of attention devoted to the war in Europe, while other wars are routinely ignored. To these friends, I have been saying that more attention should be devoted to conflicts around the world, but also that the conflict in Ukraine started at least in 2014, and that the world paid too little attention when Russia decided to take control of Crimea. The EU and NATO have been unsure about how to consider Ukraine since the beginning of the millennium, and a Cold War mentality which sees Eastern Europe as the backyard of Russia rather than an integral part of Europe survives in our institutions, in our attitudes, and in our Orientalist stance toward the Balkans and anything east of Vienna. To learn about the war and its impacts and our geopolitical imagination, we have tonight one of the sharpest European political theorists. The European Union Center, with the help of our great colleagues in IGI and the Office of the Provost, is very proud to have Ivan Krastev talking to us tonight. We're also proud of our institution and the fantastic support we have received to organize this event. As a recognition of the attention that the University of Illinois has for the area centers and their mission, we are proud to have our Vice Chancellor to Academic Affairs and Provost, Bill Bernard, introducing the speaker tonight. Bill Bernard is the interim provost who oversees the campus academic programs, policies, and priorities. He holds a BA in government from Cornell University and an MA and a PhD in political science from Duke University. Prior to being named interim vice chancellor for academic affairs and provost, Dr. Bernard was the executive vice provost for academic affairs and previously served as head of the Department of Political Science. And with a little bit of vanity, he's also one of our EUC affiliates. Please join me in welcoming Provost Bernard, who will introduce our speaker.
So thank you, Emmanuel, and good evening, everyone. Before I introduce our speaker, I just do want to say a little bit about the EU Center. I was reflecting earlier today that the EU Center is about to enter its 25th year in existence, and that's how long I've been on campus and part of the EU Center. And the EU Center, since its inception, has been central to this university's global perspective and international outreach. With its innovative master's program, support for scholarship, and timely scholarly talks, the EU Center really has been a focal point for faculty, staff, students, and members of the community interested in European politics. And EU Day each year is a highlight of that conversation, where the center brings in a policymaker, diplomat, intellectual leader to talk about important and timely issues. And I can think of no more timely, more urgent, more concerning issue than thinking about and addressing the war in Ukraine. So on behalf of the University of Illinois, it's my privilege to welcome Ivan Krastev, a world-famous political theorist. Ivan is one of Europe's well-known political thinkers and public intellectuals. He is chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia, one of Bulgaria's leading research institutes. He is an expert in trust, communities, and institutions, both as a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna and a founding board member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Krastev is known for his timely and expert analysis of global political questions, and his writing has been widely recognized. He's a contributing editor at the Financial Times and a former contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. He's the author of the 2020 book, Is It Tomorrow Yet? How the Pandemic Changes Europe? He was also the 2020 winner of the Jean Améry Prize for European essay writing. We are incredibly honored and privileged to host him on our campus this evening, so please join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Ivan Krastev.
Thank you very much for the opportunity and for the invitation. I was treated very nicely. Even I was served the dinner before I delivered anything, so I was on the safe side. Secondly, I'm going to coughing, but I did a test today. So at least on this level, you're on the safe side. And also, before starting speaking, keep in mind that in Bulgaria, this is 3 a.m. So if something goes really very wrong, blame it on the time difference, because it's, but what I'm planning to do is not discuss basically the Russia-Ukrainian war, which is very much at the center of the discussions in many universities today, but much more its impact on European Union and Europe. This is what is going to be the topic of my talk. And I want to start from Vienna, where basically I am at the moment. In 1989, in the last days of December, British-American historian Tony Judd was back then in the institute in which I'm here, and he was walking around the central station in Vienna, seeing the people. Some of them start coming because of the end of the regimes in Hungary, in GDR. There was also violence in Romania. And when he was walking around the Vienna airport, he said, and then I realized that what we have been seeing kind of for granted, the East-West divide, the Cold War, the conflict between communism and capitalism, probably can turn out to be a very small part, transitory part in European history. And then he decided to write his history of Europe after 1945 called the Post-War. I'm saying this because since then, the central station in Vienna was repaired. It is a much better place, but when you go there, starting with February, March this year, you have the same feeling, but this time not about the Cold War period, but about the post-Cold War period. You have the feeling that something dramatically has been changed. And I'm saying this because when Tony Judd was writing his book, for him the title was critically important. Europe was post-war, and it was post-war in two very important kind of senses. The first, it was post-war because European project was very much born out of the ashes of the World War II, of the experience of the World War II, and by the way, the generation that survived the war. It's not by accident that all the countries that started European Union were defeated countries during the World War II. The only European power that was kind of victorious, the United Kingdom, was not part of the initial project. But it was a post-war also in the sense that, particularly after the end of the Cold War, Europe was a place where there was a very strong consensus among the people living there that a major war is not possible in Europe anymore. Not in the world. It's not that Europeans didn't know that people have been fighting. Not that there were not wars in Europe. The Yugoslav wars have been there, and hundreds of people have been killed. But the major story was that Yugoslav's wars have been framed very much as deviations. In a certain way, it was coming from the post-war European past. This was the way the Europeans were talking to themselves. And by the way, this is an interesting perspective because I was trying to imagine talking about political science and political scientists, imagine two political scientists in 1989, in 1990. One being located in Belgrade, not knowing what is happening in the other parts of Eastern Europe and believing that what is happening in Yugoslavia is the paradigm of the post-Cold War world. And the other being staying in Prague or in Warsaw, not knowing what is happening in Yugoslavia and being that basically what he's seeing, this is the model of the world to come. Now when you look back, it can turn that the guy who was in Belgrade was going to tell us more about the current moment than the one that was in Prague. And this idea, particularly in the last 20-25 years, that no major war is possible in Europe, was one of the things that basically was shared by different political parties, groupings, leaders who actually otherwise don't share much about Europe. So in a certain way, Europe as a peace project was so successful that the very possibility of the war was excluded. And this is my first argument. This is over. And by the way, this is over because what you're seeing in the Russian-Ukrainian war is we are talking about a major war. People, particularly like me, coming from small countries, we are not great at scale. Ukraine is a very big country. Ukraine is bigger than France. As a population, Ukraine and Poland, basically they're mid-sized countries for European standards, but they're really big. This is a major war because basically the shells that in the last 3 months the Russian army has been using is on the level used by the Red Army in 1941. We are talking about classical war in which major powers with hundreds of thousands of armies, regular armies are clashing. This is not kind of a local conflicts and classical civil war type of a conflicts that people normally are talking about and which were typical very much for the post-Cold War period in different places. So suddenly, Europeans basically discovered that they're living in a totally different world. And I remember that it was reported in the media that after the annexation of Crimea, Chancellor Merkel was talking to President Obama after talking to President Putin, and she said, he's living in another world. The problem is that now we all are living in his world. This idea of basically impossibility of the war is not there anymore. And as a result of it, I'll start with 4 important assumptions on which the European project was built that have been challenged in a dramatic way. The first is economic interdependence as a source of security. This was what European Union was about. Now people are saying that the German government was basically very naive to try to come with the Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, didn't they know what is going to happen? This is very much true after 2015, but you should keep in mind that in the German political thinking, the gas projects were not commercial projects only. They were political projects. The idea is the more you are trading with somebody, the less is the risk of starting a war. And this is basically the universalization of the experience of the European integration of the 1950s and 60s. In a certain way, the Germans have been doing what they have been doing before, what worked before. It is not that they changed their policies. In a certain way, German failure was what was German success. This was absolutely the same policy. And of course, in my view, their legitimate criticism to what extent they didn't understand that annexation of Crimea was a game changer. But it is not the Germans didn't know what they were doing, and it was done by different political parties. It was both the Social Democrats and the Chancellor Merkel. So suddenly, Europeans found themselves in a situation not so different than in 1913, when most of the people, particularly economists, were believing that the level of interdependence between the European powers is so big that a major war is not possible. And suddenly you go to the historical studies and you discover that basically economic interdependence is reducing the risk of war if the trade expectations of both sides is positive. But if one of the sides starts to believe the time is not on their side, it increases the risk of conflict. And in my view, this is the time dimension, is one of the very important things that, in my view, are coming out of this conflict. Because people now are talking a lot about the return of the Cold War. And there are certain similarities, in my view, there are much more differences. But the most important reason why the Cold War never became hot is that Cold War was a clash between two optimists. Both the Soviet leaders and the American leaders believed that history is on their side. They have such a strong kind of belief in the superiority of their model that they were not feeling kind of oppressed to react now, feeling that they're going to be in a weaker position tomorrow. Rightly or wrongly, they believe that tomorrow they're going to be in a stronger position, so as a result of it, they have a good incentives to avoid conflicts. I'm saying this because economic interdependence as a source of security is now reperceived in Europe dramatically, to the extent that basically economic interdependence is perceived very much as a source of vulnerability. And this is going to affect the relations of European Union, not only with Russia, but with other places. So now, anytime when you start developing, for example, technological relations with countries in the world, be it China, or even trade relations when it comes to gas and oil with the Middle East, the question was, can it turn the same way? This is a major change. This securitization of the commercial relations was something that was making Europe very different than many states, particularly the United States. And this is not going to be the same. So this is the first challenge, which in my view comes there, and it goes everywhere. It goes to countries with very different traditions, with different fears. The second was military power. There is now a lot of talk what Europeans are giving or not giving to the Ukraine, but with some exceptions. I mean, particularly the story of the German tanks. One of the reasons that Europeans are not giving much weapons to Ukraine is that Europeans do not have weapons. In the first 3 months, Italians have been giving to the Ukrainians weapons produced in 1942. It does not mean that Europe does not have totally military industrial complex. There are countries like Italy or France that have quite developed one, but they were working for export. They were not arming. And it is also critically important because, particularly after the war in Iraq, Europeans basically, looking at what America achieved with totally superior and kind of unparalleled military power, decided that in the world that is coming, economic power matters, soft power matters, military power doesn't matter, and particularly when you're living in Europe, it doesn't matter. And then suddenly, the problem of the military power is coming back to Europe, to the extent that the German government decided to invest 100 billion euro in their defense industry. Listen, for a country like Germany, this is a cultural change. This is not a budget issue. This is changing of the identity of the country as a civilian power, as a pacifist power. But they're doing this, one, because of the war and what they saw, and basically with the position of Russia. Secondly, to be honest, because American domestic politics became so radicalized that you basically don't know to what extent the change of government of the United States, what it means for the relations with Europe. So suddenly, for the first time, Europeans try to imagine a situation in which it works at the moment with this administration. They don't know how it's going to be with the next one, particularly keeping in mind that Europe is not at the center of the geopolitical interests of the United States anymore, and that very much Europe is in a position in which Japan was during the Cold War. They're not on the major theater of competition. So I'm saying this because it is, in my view, quite important to try to see that for the last century, the role of Europe in global politics has been changing dramatically because of the rise of others, because of many things. In year 1914, the World War I was called the European War. So the European War was the World War I. So Europe was the world. European empires have been fighting each other. There were people. There were colonial empires. And during the Cold War, Europe, neither of the two major superpowers, neither Soviet Union nor the United States, have been a classical European powers, but Europe was the central stage of European politics. Cold War was about Berlin. And then come the end of the Cold War, and then Europe tried to totally reframe its importance in global politics. So they said, okay, we are not the world anymore. and we are not even the central stage of the world politics, but we are the laboratory of the world to come. The idea of the postmodern state, the post-national politics, Europeans believe that basically the other parts of the world is going to move into this direction. And the books like Robert Cooper's The Breaking of Nations and others was very critical to talk about the three worlds, the postmodern world of Europe, the modern powers, and kind of a pre-modern world and so on, which have a different ethics, different way of functioning. This kind of a situation, Europe suddenly realized that this type of a postmodern world of its own is functioning totally differently. And if before, Europe was convinced that it is surrounded by future members. Basically, European project was about hard budgets and soft borders. So now it was transformed into soft budgets and hard borders. Many of the countries which before you believed that are just aspiring to become member of the European Union became in a much more difficult relations with European Union. And we're not simply talking about Russia, we're talking Turkey, but we're talking about many other places. And then basically, and this is critically important when we're talking about military power, is that for the last 20, 25 years, talk about nuclear, possibility of nuclear war was not part of European conversation. Yeah, France is a nuclear power, and Britain is a nuclear power, but even in the last decade of the Cold War, nuclear weapons were there, but they were not talked. In a certain way, there was, of course, specialists which are going to do gaming and modeling, but unlike in 1950s and 1960s, they were at the center of the military debate. Suddenly, the major story about nuclear was about nuclear proliferation. It was not about basically the use of the major powers. This is changing dramatically. To be honest, the talk about nuclear, which President Putin has today, is very different than the talk of the last Soviet leaders. They were basically trying, we're not talking Gorbachev, even if you go back to Brezhnev, you're going to see that this was not the way they were going to talk about this. Even more, and this is becoming a major issue, Ukraine is the major failure of basically a story of control of the nuclear and the success of the nuclear policy of the post-Cold War period. You know that nuclear was the third major nuclear state. After Russia and the United States, they has the highest number of atomic weapons after the end of the Cold War, and it was the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, in which the other great powers basically have given them guarantees that if you are going to give up your nuclear weapons, you are going basically to not to worry about your sovereignty. And what happened now, the story is that who is going to give up their nuclear weapons? In a certain way, the idea of sovereignty and the idea of having nuclear weapons starts to rhyme much better than ever before. And this is becoming a major issue because in a certain way, the major success, particularly of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, was the success to basically this to be done in a framework in which proliferation of the nuclear weapons have been under control. And this is not there anymore to the extent that basically before the beginning of the war, President Zelensky said, if Ukraine still had the nuclear weapons, this war was not going to happen. So the third major change, and by the way, this is going to be extremely interesting change. I know that there are famous historians here, by the way, including the most famous academic of my and the previous generation that we have in Bulgaria outside of the countries, Professor Maria Todorova. But the interesting story about Europeans at this war is that nationalism is coming back, and Europeans does not know how to think about it in two terms. Once, basically, it appeared that they were certainly blind in the way they're reading the certain developments in Russia after the end of the Cold War. But secondly, imagine for the moment that the strength of Europe as a post-nationalist political project was that all over its periphery, you're going to have a European flags on a demonstration, be it Maidan, being basically during the Serbian demonstration of the 2000s. Now you have all over Europe Ukrainian flags. And this is a classical national liberation movement. It is a civic nationalism, but it is a kind of a mobilizing power of nationalism. And it was the heroic nature of the Ukrainian resistance that put something very important into question, and this is the post-sacrifice nature of European societies. Suddenly, European citizens were totally mesmerized by the fact that there is a society in which people are ready to die for independence. The cult of Zelensky is very strong among the European societies. In a certain way, the famous phrase, "I'm not asking for a right, I'm asking for ammunition," is one of the very few things that basically Europeans remembered. But while basically for pre-EU Europe, this type of a cult for civic nationalism and basically for mobilizing power of nationalism was nothing new, for European project it was totally kind of constructed as a post-nationalist project. So you don't know what to do with this. You admire it, do you want to follow it, how different it is going to be, how you're integrating it. This is not a simple question, and this is not simple question particularly due to the fact that as a result of the Ukrainian war, also what is happening, Russian-Ukrainian war, is that suddenly the decolonization narrative starts to replace the classical Cold War narrative. And then one thing became quite visible. European Union was founded by former imperial powers, all of them. Some of them quite acting empires, like the French one at the moment when European Union was constructed. But with the opening of the East, before it, of course, there was Greece and Ireland, but with the opening of the East, for the first time, you have a massively in the European project, the inflow of countries that have come out of the disintegration of the empires, particularly the continental empires, particularly the Habsburg one. And these two sides of the European Union have a quite different history, particularly when it comes to the understanding of sovereignty, diversity, and the very logic of how the national identity have been formed. My always kind of classical example, if you look at the cultural map of Europe in the year 1900, you're going to see basically two Europes. One which was much more ethnically and culturally homogeneous, and it was Western Europe, France, Germany. And one which was much more diverse, and this was Central and Eastern Europe, particularly Habsburg lands, but also different cultures, minorities. In the year 1939, 1/3 of the population of Poland were not Polish citizens, were not ethnic Poles, Germans, Jews, Ukrainians. Then you have the 20th century, and it goes with revolutions, war, destruction of populations, expulsion of the populations. And at the end of the 20th century, if you look at the maps, you're going to see two Europes again. One of them much more ethnically and culturally diverse, Western Europe, and the other much more ethnically homogeneous, Eastern Europe. In 1990, 97% of the population of Poland were ethnic Poles. So for many of these countries, ethnic homogeneity was redefined basically as the idea of national identity, of sovereignty. And then suddenly you have, as a result of this war, many things happening. So on one, the fear of sovereignty, which these nation states were coming from, the idea that they cannot take their states for granted, were very strongly triggered. I was reading a lot of opinion polling about countries like the Baltic countries and Poland. Listen, for them, this is their war, the level of existential threat. This is totally different of what you're going to see in Western Europe and others. They're identifying to the extent that basically they believe that if something goes wrong with Ukraine, they could be next. Is it true or not is a different question, but the perception is totally there. You have kind of a countries in war, but this is very much changing the perspective, because also suddenly, as a result of this war, you have a major demographic change in these countries. At the moment, 8% of the people living on the territory of the Polish republics are Ukrainians, and in 7% of the Ukrainian households, they're hosting Ukrainians. By the way, they're hosting people, and it was much more civil society exercise comparing with what happened in Germany during the Syrian crisis. And you can imagine what a tension and what kind of a pressure on society is with the cost of living crisis that is coming with the energy crisis and others. So from this point of view, this is one other aspect in which suddenly the war in Ukraine is kind of creating and clashing the totally different intuition about what is a national identity, what is a state identity. In 1995, Clifford Geertz, the famous American anthropologist, was giving a lecture in our institute in Vienna, by the way, a brilliant lecture, which was called The World in Pieces. And he said, contrary to what people believe, the end of the Cold War is not the moment of convergence. This is going to be the moment of divergence, and different type of differences that have been frozen by the Cold War are going to come to the surface. And he said this period is going to be shaped by looking for answers of two questions. What is a country if it is not a nation? And what is a culture if it is not a consensus? And in a certain way, the Russian-Ukrainian war is bringing these two questions again, and they're very much becoming part also of the domestic politics with the rise of different parties. And then when I said that also there was a major problem with understanding the post-communist Russia and where it comes from, I'm just going to give you two things on which I do believe that our analysis of Russia were wrong. It does not mean that all academics doing Russians were wrong. I do believe basically the analysis that shaped Western policies. One is, in my view, people simply didn't realize that for majority of the Russians, the end of communism was not a tragedy at all. There are very few of them that basically felt nostalgic for communism, but the disintegration of the Soviet Union became a kind of a personal trauma. In the Western perspective, this was the same. In a certain way, the end of communism, if you're for the end of communism, you should accept logically the disintegration of the Soviet Union. For the Russians, it was not like this. This was their country. They have, which President Putin is repeating this time all the time, 25 million Russians were left outside of the country. Secondly, with very good intentions, particularly the administration of George Bush Sr., tried rhetorically to make Russians believe that they are winners of the Cold War in the way the West was, because they remembered very much what happened after World War I. But it was very difficult for the Russians to feel winners as a result of basically losing territory, but also because of the fact that in the 1990s, Russia lost 1/3 of its GDP. The life expectancy of the Russian population went 5 years down. So there was a real resentment which started before Putin coming to power, but it was very, very strongly expressed after his coming to power, and this idea getting out of our knees was very much there. And in a certain way, for different reasons, different political leaders and parties were kind of not interested in this. They believed that this is not there. And the second reason they believed that this is there was that our focus was on the corrupt nature of the Russian regime. Listen, even for Bulgarian, and we know something about corruption, Russia is a very corrupt country. I mean, talking about scale, they know the scale. But the analysis of Russia was that Russia is so corrupt that it cannot become dangerous. There's so much relations with all the oligarchs, keeping their money in the West, with President Putin being the richest person in the world, if you're reading certain newspapers. And in my view, this is a typical kind of a mistake of a badly paid academics when they try to basically analyze the heads of states. Do you really believe that the leader of a nuclear power is going to be motivated simply by his bank account? So the moment when we have been trying to interested how much wealth the Russian elite have been accumulating, Russian leadership went into reading of history and redefining the history in the way that basically, in my view, in a certain way, we missed. And this was this strange idea of what to do with the Russian identity versus Soviet identity. From this point of view, one of the most interesting speeches of President Putin is not the one he gave on the day they started the war, but in February 22, when he gave a speech in which he declared why the Russian Federation is going to legitimize, basically recognize the separatist republics of Lugansk and Donetsk. This is, by the way, an amazing speech. Extremely anti-Soviet. This is not a speech of a red colonel, this is a speech of a white general, in which he basically claimed that Russians are the biggest victims of the Soviet Union, that the Ukraine had been created by Lenin, that of course there is no Ukrainian state. But the most interesting story was this kind of idea in which with one day you basically believe that Russia is the major victim of the Soviet Union, and on the other, the Soviet troops basically claim that they're going in these regions in order to restore the monuments of the Soviet victory. This ambiguity, in my view, is critically important, that he cannot get out of it. And there is no more tragic figure than the old Ukrainian lady who went with the Soviet flag to meet the coming Russian army. She believes that she is basically meeting the Soviet army. This was a Russian ethnic army. And what happened the moment the Russian army entered these regions was that this was the end of the Soviet identity. There was a Soviet identity allowing Russian-speaking populations in Ukraine to live in Ukraine without asking themselves, are they Ukrainian or Russians? We have seen this, by the way, in Bosnia. The moment when the Russian army came, you're either Russian or Ukrainian. And there is no, if you want to be Soviet, you should come to the United States or to Vienna. No, but this is, you cannot survive, simply, basically, you cannot. And this is something that is very importantly happening. And from this point of view, in order to basically recreate a Russian ethnic empire, President Putin basically destroyed what was the Soviet legacy and on which basically to a certain extent the Russian influence in the post-Soviet space was built. And one of the major collateral damage of this war is going to be the status of the Russian language. I have been in the Ukrainian bookstores for almost all these years, and you can go there and most of the books have been in Russian. I'm seeing basically all the Ukrainian refugees in Vienna, and even when they speak very bad English, they're going to talk to you in English. Nevertheless, that they suspect that you speak Russian, because for them speaking Russian now is a political claim. It is not a language issue. And I'm saying all this because this was the things that basically we're unaware, and also we didn't realize that, and this is psychological speculations, but the nice things about this type of lectures is that you can be speculative without being killed immediately. And this was the following. President Putin was outside of his country when his country was dramatically changing. He was staying in Dresden. He's a middle-level intelligence officer. And I have talking to a lot of people that have been outside of their countries in a moment of a major change. It's very difficult to understand, because you remember one country and over months, people that you know are doing things that you cannot understand. And of course, in his book from the first person, he's saying the story, how Moscow was silent when he asked for support. But the most important is he never realized how was it possible the nuclear power to lost its state. And part of this obsession with nuclear is the message Soviet Union was destroyed because basically we forgot to tell the world that we're nuclear and they should not mess with us. And from my point of view, all these type of questions are critical, because this war, and on this I'm very strong, and I'm going to give you some polling data, it is not Russia's war. It is a Putin's war. This war of a particular leader and a particular generation in Russian politics. It's not that the Russians are against the war. This is not what I'm saying, and I'm going to give some data. But part even of the Russian elites were more surprised by Russia going on Kiev than most of us, because they never read and believed the American intelligence, probably were more ready to do this. But secondly, because Putin didn't prepare them for this. Because this war didn't have a narrative, because the narrative should have been victory. He was seeing the Ukraine as a second coming of the Crimea annexation, totally kind of misreading the major differences in anything. Ethnicity and also the meaning of the last 7 years. And I'm saying this because there is now a lot of talks that the president was misinformed, that there was a lot of intelligence failures on the Russian side. To be honest, probably this is true. but he was misinformed by his genuine and deep conviction that Ukrainians are going to meet the Russian troops as liberators. Not getting what is happening in Ukraine, not giving any agency to the Ukrainians, believing that everything that is happening there is simply kind of a Western-driven elite operations. His total misreading of Maidan, basically as a classical national liberation movement, which he is in. This is the major story, and not that the intelligence didn't tell him this or that. And this is why they didn't have the narrative still, and this is why when you go on the opinion polls, and I'm talking about opinion polls done both by Levada but also within the Russian government, you're seeing 4 groups of people, and these 4 groups of people are critically important for the way the war goes. 1/3 of the Russian population is strongly for the fact that war should be won, that this is very important, that it is an existential threat for Russia. This 1/3 are mostly people older than 50 who are not going to fight in this war. The second group is people who, they were supportive for the special operation, but they were not supportive for the war. They were not against basically a Russian army capturing Kiev, but they don't want to be part of it. There is 20% of the Russian population which was against the war from the very beginning. And there was this 20% who don't know where they are because it is basically never a major issue for them. But I'm saying all this because while for the Ukraine, this became the great patriotic war. For the Russia, it failed to be a great patriotic war. And this is why all the problem of mobilization, outside of the failure of logistics, a failure of basically people understanding what it is about. And then I go to the last kind of a major issue that happened and challenge to the way the Europeans have been functioning. There was one common language that the West and Russia had during the Cold War and after the Cold War, and this was World War II. Both have been on the winning sides. Fascism was the common enemy, so when you don't know what to talk about, you go there. And suddenly, this common language is not there anymore. Because during the Russian-Ukrainian war, basically both sides addressed in the uniforms of the World War II. Russia claiming basically that Ukraine is a Nazi state and fighting Ukrainians, they fight. Hitler, let's put it slightly exaggerated. And on the other side, basically, even on the level of the population, because I saw some anthropological reports, many of the Ukrainians seeing the Russian army and the destructions that they are giving is totally similar to what happened to them during the World War II. This is so dramatic because also on the level of symbolic politics, you are never going to understand the symbolism of the certain things if you don't know that they share the same experience of the World War II. For everybody who have been following the famous story with the Snake Island, this famous Russian ship, go and fuck yourself. For somebody like me, living in Bulgaria in 70s and 80s and seeing a lot of Soviet war movies, this was the story of the Brest Fortress. This is this type of no major strategic military importance, but this is the idea: you cannot break us, we're standing there. This is just kind of a heroism for heroism's sake. This is not for having a military task. And both sides know it because they have been watching the same films. And this is very different, sharing a culture, particularly this culture. And I'm saying this because for the Europeans, suddenly, and this is what comes from the opinion polls that the European Council on Foreign Relations was doing, the idea that Europe is decoupling from Russia for a long period of time, economically and even culturally, is shared including by people who otherwise are very skeptical about war or joining something that is defined as a peace party, people who said that the most important is the war to stop now. And this is totally rechanging Europe. And I'm going to end up with 3 types of these changes before kind of ending. One is, in order to understand what is happening in Europe now, keep in mind that the 3 previous crises that defined the European experience of the last 15 years, global financial crisis, migration crisis, and COVID, all of them are coming back with the war in Ukraine, but this is like the second coming, with a totally different intensity and with a kind of a different political expressions. For example, we are again back in the discussions about the Italian debt. and serving the Italian debt and the stability of the euro. And on the level of the money that are going to be spent, some of the energy subsidies for some of the countries is going to be bigger than the money that went for the COVID spendings on the national level. So we're talking about a major kind of spendings which are going to change European economic model, and Europe can go for a kind of a relatively high inflation for a longer period of time, which was something that European Central Bank basically was always against it. Then look at the migration crisis. The number of migrants coming from Ukraine are twice higher than the migrants that came from Syria. But if you see how differently they have been welcomed, it also tells you something, because the countries that basically have been most refugee skeptical during the Syrian crisis, the East European countries, now are the countries that basically are hosting most refugees. Poland, but also the Czech Republic. Czech Republic per capita is the country that is hosting most people. And they really hosted very much in private houses. This is very strong civil society. Why? And this was a big debate in Europe, because the story is, of course, the fact that Ukrainians are treated so differently than, for example, the Syrians, created a huge problem in the relations of European Union with some of the third world countries, which they said, listen, you care about your own, you didn't care about anything else. But part of the story, probably there is religious, probably there is an ethnical element, but the most important is, this is the war that you understand. And this is kind of, but you're going to see, and from this point of view, in the long term, this type of immigration crisis is going to affect all these countries. If you go back to the experience of Turkey in the first 3 years, Turkey was extremely open, both on government level and society level, to hosting of refugees. If you're going to see now, the major problem for President Erdogan being re-elected is inflation, but even bigger is the relations towards the refugee, which is extremely negative. And part of the stories that basically he's trying to do in the Kurdish regions is very much based on his ambition to relocate people and so on. So how this is going to affect Europe? How this is going to affect Ukraine, in which most of the people who left a young woman with kids, and these kids will go to schools. And if this is going to be a prolonged war, and if the kids are going to like the schools in which they are, basically the probability of going back is going to be lower, regardless of the fact that the level of patriotism for the Ukrainians who are outside of Ukraine is really astonishing. Basically, being in Vienna, you can see and you can only admire their commitment to the places they're coming. But then Ukraine can end up, after prolonged war, as a very much depopulated space. And I'm saying this because in places like Donbass, where basically the Ukrainian army now are coming back, but after they withdraw, I was showing a map of regions in which 3 million people have been living before February 24. At the moment, you have 300,000 people. So these movements of people is the second part of the crisis, and this crisis come back to Europe. And the third one is the relations between the government and basically control of information. Because COVID was very important from this point of view, how far the government can go, where goes the individual, the rights of the individual. And this kind of information policies, of course, are coming back. And it's quite interesting that some of the parties that now are politically very much opposing European policies of the war, some of them have been created on the basis of the anti-vaxxer movements during the COVID crisis. So all the constituency, anti-establishment constituencies that have been created in the previous crisis, they're going to be repoliticized and basically regrouped as a result of this crisis. So for Europe, probably the next 6 or 9 months are going to be politically, not necessarily economically, the most difficult from the very creation of the Union. Because the combination of the cost of living crisis, major divide in the way the countries basically perceive the war, and also impossibility for Europe to have an autonomous policy on this conflict, because the threat perceptions are so different that honestly only 2 countries outside of the United States have any influence over the Ukrainian governments, and this is the Polish government and the British government, because the British government has invested a lot in training the middle-level commanders of the Ukrainian army. So from this point of view, even if Berlin and Paris wants to do something, nevertheless, of what they can do nothing. And this brings me to the second problem. And the second problem is that as a result of the Russian-Ukrainian war, the German question comes back in European politics in a different way. In all 3 previous crises, Germany was part of the answer. You can dislike the answer during the financial crisis, but Germany was the provider of solution of last resort. During the refugee crisis, East Europeans, legitimately or illegitimately, were very unhappy with the way that Germany imposes decision on others, but Germany was the country that basically hosted people. This was the country that took the cost. And of course, during the COVID crisis, Germany allowed level of basically spendings on the European level, which was critically important for this kind of recovery package to be done. For the first time this crisis, Germany is in a vulnerable position from 3 different perspectives. Morally, some of East European countries are extremely critical for unwillingness of the Germans to provide weapons. Economically, because of the dependence on the Russian gas, Germany is going to be one of the countries that is going to be most impacted by this crisis. But thirdly, that the 3 major pillars on which the German model was based, basically outsourcing security to the United States, developing economic dependence on the cheap Russian oil, and having the Chinese market as the major export market in which most of the German exports go, all 3 get into a crisis at the same time. And I do believe this is going to push Europeans to a situation which is going to be very different, and I'm going to end up on this. Of course, this is an open question. Being Bulgarian, and particularly Bulgarian who was 25-year-old in 1989, I do believe I'm expert on only one thing, the fragility of everything political. People can go in different directions. In 1980s, communism in Bulgaria was stable like nature. And over weeks, it disappeared. But at the same time, it is quite clear that European Union is going to go through certain type of institutional and political changes. And for example, the power of Central and East European countries, for good or for bad, is going dramatically to increase. The gravity of the European Union is moving to the East as a result of the war. And the question is not anymore the enlargement in the way it was before. It's about consolidation of the geopolitical sphere of influence of the West and on the European continent. So regardless, for example, people now are talking about the European integration of Ukraine. Ukraine is much more part of the European Union than people realize. Just in order to fight the war, forget about anything weapons related. Ukraine needs between 5 and 7 billion per month in order to make basically its economy functioning. Secondly, in a certain way, all these countries are already in. Of course, it does not mean that they're going to be Brussels here and there, but European Union has changed dramatically. Decision-making has changed dramatically. By the way, this is true not only for Ukraine. It's totally changing the position of countries like Moldova, the Balkans, and so on. So in security and energy terms, they're in. But of course, this means that there should be institutional changes, that it means that basically the tensions between geopolitical Europe and the rule of law Europe, in which some of the countries like Poland and Hungary have been as a big problem for Brussels, are going to be spelled differently, and these tensions is going to be there. I'm saying all this, and this is where I want to end up. At the same time, this war created something that basically Europe probably needed, and this is certain type of on one level, understanding that the status quo that was there does not exist anymore. My feeling, particularly also with Germany for some of the years, was that Chancellor Merkel was defending a status quo that has disappeared. It works very much, but the world is not going to be back where it was. But secondly, because of what happened in Russia, we realized that Probably democracies have their own problems, but authoritarian regimes are not overperforming. They are not overperforming in China, where they were greatly successful to lock down people, but they cannot basically unlock them, simply because the government is not ready to change any policy and basically to declare that any policy probably was wrong. But particularly in Russia, where you can see that a huge concentration of power in certain personality is creating risks that you don't expect to have. So this kind of understanding that with all your problems, probably your system is more resilient than you believed yesterday. And from this point of view, Ukraine was a great example, not only for the Russians, for many Europeans and Americans, by the way. Ukraine was a totally dysfunctional and ungovernable place before the war. And suddenly, it's not simply that people are dying. The country is functioning. I mean, the country is functioning, which is not easy. And this shows you that this kind of a decentralized place, which was kind of messy and people basically never highly overexcited, and their televisions. Can you imagine President Putin being the major character into a comedy? It was always kind of a highly patriotic tragedy, but it appeared that comedies can be more resilient than tragedies, at least as a literary forms and as a movie productions. So from this point of view, I do believe it's going to be a difficult period. I don't know how it's going to end up, but one thing in my view is critical. European Union is not going to be where it was even 2 years ago, neither institutionally, not on the level of economic policies, not on the level of the balance of powers. It can become better, it can become worse, but unfortunately, being Bulgarian, I don't know the future, because there is a beautiful Bulgarian joke with which I'm going to end up. In our country, and I'm sure that Professor Todorova here is totally going to agree with me, we have probably more fortune tellers per capita than almost anywhere in the world. So the joke is about two very famous fortune tellers who met at the center of Sofia, and one told the other, "Listen, I'm seeing the future, and you are okay. How am I?" Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we have some time for questions. I'm happy to give the microphone to people in the audience or pass it around. We already have a microphone, so perhaps we can gather 2 or 3 questions and then answer directly. Ben, you have a microphone. Lucia, you have a microphone, so whoever wants to go first.
All right. Okay, good. I always get worried about how loud these things get. You were talking a lot about the refugees coming from Ukraine, and I was just also wondering what kind of hindrance is happening in European Union countries on the people leaving Russia. Mostly because the way that the borders are locked down currently, it's like either they're going to Turkey or they're going to Finland. And then in your experience, how is those countries handling the influx of Russians leaving, and then how is Russia trying to keep those people from leaving?
Thank you very much. By the way, this is a great also question based on something different. In order to understand how different this war is from the Cold War is, remember that during the Cold War, the term Russism was impossible. During the Cold War, you have an evil regime, but people are good. This was the starting point. Is it true or not, it doesn't matter, but the whole ideological frame was that you have a regime and the people are the major victims of the regime. So from this point of view, it was the Soviet Union that had been closing the borders. On the western side, the borders had been open and you're saying people come. What is changing with this war is that it has very much the characteristics of the post-colonial wars, which always go essentialists. Basically, when Algerians started talking about French in the 1960s, they were not talking very much about some French. They were basically trying to talk about all French. And you have this major change, and this creates a huge problem. And by the way, it's extremely tragic. to be a Russian political refugee outside of Russia in Europe today. Because when you're in Russia, you're treated almost as a Ukrainian. But when you're in Europe, you're treated like a Russian. And as a result of it, problem of the closing of the borders on European side is becoming one of the politically most contested issue. And of course, it's easier for the United States, but you have these very small countries like Finland or the Baltics. Some of them with Russian minorities. They simply fear the numbers. If the numbers which I'm reading are right, since September 21st, the day of the mobilization, 700,000 people have left Russia. It's probably not all of them are people who are running from the war. All these statistics, but this is a statistics based on how many people have crossed, and only in Kazakhstan around 200,000 people has crossed. This is a major issue, and before it, you know that there was also different figures who is leaving the country, but at least we know for two groups that left even before mobilization, and one was IT specialists, the most mobile part of the population. Some of them working for big Western companies, they left and grow with the companies. For example, Deutsche Telekom took out 1,200 people, which are developers and others. It's not easy to recover as a country this type of a talent that you have lost. Secondly, and this is extremely important, is that what you see from the numbers coming from the war, you're going to see that the probability to be killed in these first 7 months of the war, if you're born in Buryatia, is 300 times higher than if you're born in Moscow. For mainly financial reasons, the way basically people have been mobilized before the partial mobilization, which means there was very much based on promise that their debts are going to be forgiven. You have a huge disproportional representation of the people from poor periphery of the Russian Federation. Buryatia is one of the examples, Dagestan is another. But this started to create tensions within the republics. And I do believe as a result of it, the demographic issue is one of the least discussed issue, extremely important from the point of view of the Russian president. In the 3 months before the war started, President Putin, without being asked by anybody, in a different interviews, 3 times made one and the same thing. He quoted a prediction that Mendeleev did in 19th century, that in year 2000 there are going to be 500 million Russians in the world. And then he said, and now there are 150 million Russians. And this idea of the Russians as a demographically shrinking population, I have as kind of, everybody has his small obsessions. The politics of demographic decline is one of mine. But if you go with all states of the Union addresses of the Russian president, you're going to see how important for him at some point was to claim that he has reversed the demographic decline and the life expectancies have been increased and so on. And then all this started changing already 4 years ago, and then came COVID. COVID was very interesting to be analyzed in the context of this war. Russia has 1 million excess deaths. It's very high. This is not simply people who died from COVID, but yeah, we are all specialists on COVID statistics, so you know what is the excess death. But what is also extremely important is that as a result of it, the fear that Russia basically is losing population, in my view, was one of the motivations that we need more Russians. And here they are, Belarusians, Ukrainians, simply because there are not enough Russians in the world. And when people are now talking about a apocalyptic mood in certain type of a governing circles, demography is a very important part of it. And it was in 2018 that President Putin made the statement that he does not see the need for the world to exist if there is no Russia in this world. And part of it was not back then created to political issues. It was very much about the demographic decline. This is not particular to Russia. Most of East Europeans have it. Many of the European countries. In France, there was a very strong on the right. But this is very important because unlike all others, he can act on it because of the centralization of power.
Could you please speak louder?
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. I forgot that I'm not using the microphone. Sorry for this. And yeah.
Hi, This is actually the second talk I've seen by you. The first was November 2019, Bratislava, where you were with Masha Gustin and the late David Graeber.
Yeah.
And that was a very interesting one for me because my first experience with Slovakia was 1992. And to walk into where I used to buy walnuts, and there's this very, kind of aestheticized remembrance of the Velvet Revolution with photographs of tanks. And now it feels like that whole talk is in a time capsule. But there's one moment I really remember. First of all, I want to apologize. We didn't have a lavalier mic for you that you have to hold back.
No, this was...
but also, yeah. One thing I really remember is that I believe it was Graeber had said that Obama was selling hope and he was only really interested in power, and people clapped. And I'm sitting there just, having a moment away from Trump's regime, like, why are you doing this? And part of this, I hope, is disinformation, and I'm wondering how much that plays into how Putin was able to, do what he was able to do, and everybody was kind of asleep.
Listen, this is a great question. First, you should remember that in 2012, when President Obama, in the beginning of his second term, was asked who of the political leaders he felt closest for this period, he quoted that it is President Medvedev. President Obama very much, out of his bigger strategy, wanted to try to integrate Russia in a certain type of a space. From this point of view, some of the cultural misunderstanding was critically important. And part of it was that even during their famous first meeting, there's certain things on which the Russian president, and for good or bad, I have seen Putin several times. And there is two things that I'm going to tell you in order to understand how different the conversation goes. President Putin was obsessed that Obama disrespects him because he has made women in charge of the Russia policies. And in the beginning, I didn't realize what he was talking about, because all the time he was talking about Obama's babes. And we were sitting there, and there was a very senior American academic specialist on Russia, Angela Stant, and even she didn't get it. And then we pushed him to say what he had in mind, and he said, this is the humiliation. You have Samantha Power in the UN doing Russia. You have Toria Nuland in the State Department. You have Susan Rice in the National Security Council. You have Fiona Hill as the senior intelligence person. And the idea that everything is about Russia, and everything is this culture, and this has a lot to do, and this is very kind of a Russian East European kind of a masculinity story in which you really believe that, first of all, you're at the center of politics, and this is what the major problem. President Obama made two comments that, in my view, are standing with President Putin forever and for some time shape his policy. First, he said once that Russia is a regional power. Listen, this is one of those things that you can say and you can never prove, but I do believe that particularly the decision of Russia to interfere in the Syrian conflict, which back then was a kind of a much more risky operation, was try to prove that they are not a regional power. And secondly, at some point, President Obama said, I'm not quoting properly, but this was the meaning, this was the image that he used. He said that Putin, who is really very angry, it's totally, he reminds him very much of these students standing on the last desks in the school room and complaining about his debt. So East Europeans were not famous for kind of our anti-racist imagination. This goes for all of that. This is not particular to President Putin. Also because of the lack of encounter. But if you're going to ask about a stereotype, what you believe about the black boy in school is that he's sitting on the last desk and basically he's complaining all the time. And then suddenly this change of roles. Do you know that in 2008, there is only one country in which, on the question, whom do you want to win the elections, John McCain was doing better than Obama? And do you know that this country was Russia? And you remember that John McCain was not the most Russia-friendly politician in American politics? This idea of having a black president was a problem. And not simply Russian society, I don't know to what extent they were interested, but for the Russian elite, this was a change which they do not understand. because it was about America. They don't have a problem with the black presidents in Africa and so on. And this kind of a change was ended up that, contrary to many things, basically Putin was perceiving Obama as passive-aggressive. On the other side, East Europeans had the feeling that Obama is not getting it. And particularly, first after Georgia, but particularly after Crimea. And they didn't get it because they didn't realize that the major strategy of the Russian president back then was not to come with the alternative system of values and not to come with basically different ideology, but to expose the hypocrisy of the liberal order. You probably remember that basically during the Russian operation in Crimea, several European leaders have been asking President Putin, is there a Russian special force in Crimea? He said no. And listen, normally people are lying in politics all the time, but normally you're lying when there is a certain level of deniability. But today they knew the names of the people. And by the way, 10 days later he gave them medals. Why he's lying? In order to be accused of being a liar, so he can say the liars like you. What about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and so on? So this idea to try to imitate the West in order to expose the hypocrisy of the West is critical. If you have listening to his last speech, it was very much about Russia being anti-colonial power in the world of the European empire, and Ukraine basically probably the proxy power of colonialism. So this kind of a story always mirroring you. I don't want to distinguish myself from you. I'm going to tell you that probably I'm not better than you, but you're not better than me. And I do believe this type of a symbolic politics went so far and escalated so much that part of the confrontation you cannot easily explain on the level, for example, to talk about, for example, nuclear does not have any military meaning, any. You cannot achieve anything on the ground in this type of a war with a tactical nuclear weapon. This is very much about making a point, about breaking European support, about scaring this or that. This is not a weapon that is going to win the war for you. You have other weapons, by the way, that you can use for this. And in my view, this is because I was, when we had been working with Stephen Holmes on our book on imitation politics, one of the interesting things of somebody like René Girard was that he made a point that is very scary. He said, similarity does not breed security and peace. Similarity breeds resentment and conflict. The more we want the same thing, the more confrontational the world becomes. And I do believe we reach this point, which he defines as kind of escalation to extremes. And this is at least my reading. Otherwise, the East European view on Obama, this was interesting. We were viewing Obama like Gagarin. Something happened which was so unexpected in the way you cannot end up with a man in Cosmos, so it was so unexpected for East Europeans who didn't follow the dynamics of American politics with the black president, but there was a respect for what Americans did, not everywhere, but there was an admiration that Americans did something that was kind of beyond the imagination. But in Russia, this was perceived also as the end of the world that they know.
Yes, thank you very much for a fascinating lecture as far as I could understand it back here. 2 points. One, your argument about using trade and economics for security stuff. Obviously, that was a foundational principle of the European Union. I'm not so sure that it was so central in Germany's relationship with Russia. I think there were many other things going on too. One, very strong economic interests in Eastern Germany that were tied to Russia and that would have to be sacrificed with great political costs if that relationship was not continued. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, the idea, particularly in the Social Democratic Party, that Since the Ostpolitik of the 1970s, you had to get closer to Eastern Europe, and particularly, of course, to the Soviet Union and then to Russia, not realizing that the real victim of Nazi Germany, the most severe victim of Nazi Germany, was not Russia, but Ukraine. The greatest killing fields in World War II were in Ukraine and not in sort of trunk Russia. So, in other words, for that reason, there were very strong ideas that you had to continue these strong relations with Russia. Secondly, and this is a question that I have. Yeah. My understanding of the gist of your lecture was that you're stressing the return of ethnic nationalism as an organizing principle of politics in Europe. And so you're dividing the European Union in a more ethnic nationalist part and a less ethnic nationalist part. You're saying that the more ethnic nationalist part is gaining in power, and you're also saying that the war in the Ukraine broke the admiration of the common good memories of the Soviet Union into two ethnic nationalisms. I think to a certain extent that's true, but I think you are underplaying the countervailing forces. So, for example, while there is, of course, an ethnic nationalist element in Ukrainian nationalism, there's also very much an element of wanting to be like the Europeans, wanting to belong like Europeans, a free movement and free trade, all these kinds of things. And there's also lots of countervailing movements against the rise of ethnic nationalism, both in Western and Eastern Europe. So
thank you very much. By the way, both of them were totally great, great comments. First, I'm going to agree very much on Germany, but making one thing: these trade policies and basically change through trade was quite important, because at some point what happened in economic terms was that suddenly Eastern Europe became more important in trade terms for Germany than Russia. Germany is trading more with Poland than with Russia, and it was quite critically important when they realized it. But even beyond the Ostpolitik of the Social Democrats, the idea was that if you're keeping Russia, and particularly because part of the German thinking was Russia is a country with a lot of natural resources that Europe is lacking, and we should need and keep it there, because in the world of tomorrow, basically the fighting for the natural resources is going to be there. My idea is, of course, there was commercial interest. Where you're totally right is particularly on the Social Democratic Party, Soviet was very much identified with Russia. Because you're right, even not Ukraine, Belarus is the place which has the most destruction during the World War II. Basically every fourth citizen was killed. And this became a huge problem during this war. And this became particularly a huge problem in the discourse of President Steinmeier when he said, basically, we're doing this to the Russians because of our guilt in the World War II. And Ukrainians said, listen, what about us? And this one. You slightly radicalize but for good reasons, my argument. My argument is the following. I don't believe that we're going to be back to the ethnic nationalism in it was, but I do believe we're very much about redefining what is sovereignty. And here comes the interesting question to answer you. If you basically believe that the major thing that is happening is simply consolidation of the European Union in the opposition to the Russian invasion, it's not easy to understand the decision of the Polish government basically to go very tough on reparations towards Germany. And a very strong anti-German discourse in Poland, because with all absolutely legitimate, by the way, criticism coming from the Polish side of the German policy with respect to the Ukrainian crisis, you can expect them to focus on Russia, at least till the moment basically the Russia issue is not the central issue as a security threat. But in my view, what we are seeing is not so much simply the rise of ethnic nationalism, but the rise of identity politics on the international level. This will be my major discourse. And the identity politics very much based on victimhood. And from this point of view, all the states, there is a beautiful novel by a Bulgarian writer, Georgi Gospodinov, which is translated into English, called Time Shelter. And one part of the novel is that European leaders who failed basically to agree on a common future decided to organize a referenda, each country in which decade of the 20th century wants to go back. So if we don't know where we want to go ahead, at least to decide where we'll go back. And he's basically giving where Germans want, where basically French, where Poles. Interestingly enough, the referendums much more is to find the decade in which we have been the biggest victim, the most mistreated, where basically we paid the price of this because it appeared that victimhood gives a much stronger identity than success, than glorification. And this is what I see happening in European politics in different levels. This is not simply ethnic nationalism. And by the way, classical ethnic nationalism is not going to come back for many reasons. And secondly, what I don't believe is going to come back is a classical economic nationalism. Because for countries like Bulgaria, there is no national economy. You cannot be protectionist, simply. Even if somebody wants to be, you cannot be. The European economy is really integrated to the level that you cannot basically disintegrate on economic principle. But suddenly, exactly because of it, you can have very much policies in which the states are trying to affirm their identity, quite often resisting their allies and not their enemies. By the way, Bulgarian-Macedonian case was also very critically important on this because Bulgarian position was much more towards Brussels and Washington than towards Skopje. The idea is the power to say no. We can say no. And I find this a kind of a major rebalancing. And secondly, and this was at the heart of our book with Stephen Holmes, I always believed that Central and Eastern Europe absolutely genuinely wanted to be like the West, to imitate the West. And this was not a colonial policy, this was demand coming from people because the idea was that the Western society was a normal society. So as a result of it, we can treat the democratic transition as a collective migration of the East to the West. Some people migrated individually, but most of them with their states migrated in the institutions of the European Union. But what the colleagues who are doing migration policies knows is the classical problem of the second generation of migrants. The moment basically you're integrated in the system, you start to resent, you see basically the ceiling glass, you have a politics about the identity lost. And I do believe that in many of these countries, you see a classical example of a second generation of migrants politics. What is interesting about the Ukrainian war is that some of these trends have been there before, they were not created there. But now they have been empowered in a different way. And in my view, one of the major things was the changing view on Germany. It's not simply the most powerful, but the most consolidating power of the European Union. And this was there during the financial crisis for the South, but back then the Eastern Europe stayed with Germany. It was back during the refugee crisis, but then the Western Europe and the South states with Germany. And now for different reasons, everybody, for good and bad reasons, is questioning the German role, and the German-French relations, of course, are not playing the same role as they were playing before. And this is amazing because if you see countries like Poland now, you have a very strong influence in some of, for example, the Baltic republics. Mr. Orban has a very strong influence in the Balkans. So every enlarging of the European Union means also a major transfer of power within the European Union. So I'm sure that when it comes to the 25th anniversary of the EU Center, we'll see some power shifts for good or bad in Europe.
So let me remind everybody that it's 4 a.m. in Bulgaria right now. So perhaps the very last question, if we have, otherwise, going once, going twice. Thank you so much. This has been great.